All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Aaron Tomlinson, and welcome to Sunday Morning Live. If this is your first time watching me, thank you for joining. If you're able to watch live, if you're watching by replay, let me know. Today, I want to talk about spiritual experience. What is spiritual experience? Why is it important? And most importantly, how can we develop the capacity for spiritual experiences? So if you've been following me for any time at all, and a lot of you have followed me throughout this entire journey, but for those that may not know me, I was a pastor, leader in the church, Christian church, charismatic church for many, many years. Did all kinds of different things. I don't want to belabor stuff that I've already gone over for people that have watched me before, heard me speak before. But in 2016, it was actually August 13th, 2016. So right around the 3 years. Where did I get that? What is it now? It feels like 3 years, but 9 years ago, I had an experience that transformed my life. Probably one of the most powerful experiences that I've ever had, that kicked off a series of events that caused me to enter into what is now known as deconstruction. Really, I wouldn't even call it, I guess, crisis, if you use the word crisis correctly. It was a crisis of faith. And spent a lot of time interacting with other people who were deconstructing. Had no idea when it started to happen to me that there was going to be such a powerful movement in that direction, that so many other people were experiencing, either had been experiencing or were going to experience the same thing. I started talking about religious trauma before it was really on anybody's radar. And I can speak to that because I'm also a professional counselor. And one of my areas of expertise is helping people to address trauma. And because of my background, therefore, an area of expertise is helping people to address religious trauma and and really resolve that and heal from that and get over that. That's a lot of what I do in my coaching practice, as well as in my professional counseling practice. Help people resolve all kinds of various different traumas, because I believe that trauma is at the root of most mental and emotional suffering and mental and emotional problems that we have today. So I've spent a ton of time training, studying, and working with people who have experienced all kinds of trauma, including religious trauma. And then really over about the last 10 months or so, I have been pivoting a little bit away from all the discussion about deconstruction, much to the dismay of some people, believe it or not. But anytime you get known for something and you pivot off of what it is that you used to talk about or used to be known for in terms of your expertise or your sharing, you're always going to lose people in that process, because they're not necessarily going to be interested in where you're pivoting or what you're pivoting towards. So I have been pretty adamant throughout the last 9 years that even though I no longer consider myself religious, no longer consider myself a Christian, certainly no longer a pastor in any kind of traditional sense, and but I've been pretty adamant about maintaining the reality that we are spirit beings, that spiritual reality exists, and that it's a worthwhile pursuit in our lives. So what I would like to do today is talk about a little bit about my journey, share some things that I don't think I've shared publicly before. If I have, I haven't gone into it very much. And also help people who are following understand the direction that I'm pivoting in and the direction that I'm headed. So before I get into all of that, I just want to check and make sure that I'm streaming in all the right places. I'm on YouTube and Facebook currently, and I am planning on uh, increasing my social media presence and getting more information out there, because I'm excited about the direction that things are going in my life. And I'm excited about the opportunity to share this knowledge with other people in a way that I think will really, really benefit and help, has the potential to benefit and help a lot of people. I know there is a ton of stuff now out there on all kinds of stuff. um, and if we're not careful, we can listen to so many different things that it can become quite confusing for us. And so, one of the other things I want to talk about today is the importance of finding your own unique and personal spiritual path, if you're interested in that, and how you can do that. So, give me just a second to check my settings and stuff here, and we'll jump into it. Also, allowing for a little bit of time for people that want to jump on live. Again, I do this every Sunday morning at 10 a.m., virtually every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. I live in Colorado. And again, right now I'm just doing it on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching on either one of those platforms and you're watching live, thank you for joining me again today. Give me just a quick second here. Hope you're doing well. Take a minute and get a cup of coffee or something and sit down. I think it's going to be an interesting and dynamic discussion. All right, so 9 years ago, I'm not going to belabor this because I've shared the story in other videos that I've done. And for people that do follow me, I don't want to bore you with the same old stuff. But in August 13th, 2016, some trauma from my youth was triggered for me. And I thought I had dealt with all of this. I thought I had resolved all of this. Christianity for me had provided me a model through which I thought I could heal and resolve a lot of this traumatic stuff that I had experienced when I was younger. And I got triggered about it in the afternoon, and I laid down to meditate. And when I laid down to meditate, I had this experience that quite literally just opened my eyes to a lot of the dysfunction that was taking place within myself, within my own life, within the church, and some of the what I would consider to be very spiritually and psychologically harmful attributes of at least the Christian tradition that I myself had been devoted to for, at that time, over 25 years of my life. And it was quite it was quite the rattling experience. There was a lot of shock to it. It was kind of traumatic in and of itself because there was so much shock trauma that came with that. And then I spent several years unpacking what happened in that 15 minutes. But I think, let me just give you a little bit more background on myself. One of the things that is always been frustrating for me, especially when I was in ministry, was the tendency when I would identify myself as a Christian, as a believer. I would identify myself particularly as a pastor or a leader within within the church, within the faith, was trying to differentiate who I was and what I was doing in those capacities from the cultural perception of what Christianity is and what it means to be a leader in that community or in that group. So, like I said, I had a lot of trauma that occurred in my life when I was 16, 17, 18 years old. And I was raised in a really sort of traditional rural white household. We went to church on Sundays. Certainly our religion, we were Methodists. Certainly our religion played a part and a role in our family and played an important part. But as I've talked to many, many people who were raised or, say they were raised Christians, there was nothing fundamentalist about how I was raised. And by fundamentalism, I mean there wasn't there wasn't a dogmatic approach. I mean, we were taught sort of the basics, right? Love your neighbor, do unto others, sort of the golden rule kind of stuff, honesty, hard work, those values that typically get associated with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which is what we were. and then, certainly we said our prayers. My mom taught me to pray at night before I went to bed. Now I lay me down to sleep. Not even a joke. That's exactly what I was taught. And we would say grace before meals, not always. So that was, and we would go to church on Sundays for about an hour. And then I would go to youth group, YMF, or MYF, Methodist Youth Fellowship, go to retreats, church camp, stuff like that. But always from a very young age, I had a sense of some connection to God, some connection to the divine that was not shaped or formed for me by the group, but was something that was more intuitive, deeply intuitive, deeply personal. So when I went through some difficult events through my latter teenage years, and I'm getting ready to start my life as a young man and start my life as an adult, it was natural for me to lean into that sense of personal devotion and relationship with God that I had. That did not mean that I picked up and went to church. It just meant that I was spending a lot of time in contemplation, meditation, and prayer. I didn't even have the terms contemplation or meditation back then, but it was just something that was sort of innately in me since I was a child. And so I was using those practices that I had developed as a child in the way of relating to the divine, in the way of relating to God, to get through this time period. And I became very interested then in learning more about the Christian faith. So I would spend a lot of time at the Christian bookstore, didn't have a lot of money back then, and they would allow me, I developed such a relationship at the Christian bookstore that they would really allow me to use it kind of like a library, not in that I could take the books out, but that I could go sit there and read for hours in the store. Eventually, I started, trading some time, helping them stock shelves and helping in the music department, where they carried, all the latest contemporary Christian music and all that stuff. And it was a very transformative experience for me. It was very personal. It was very devotional. And it was very transformative, very healing for me. And I became excited about it. And so I started to share with my friends. My friends had seen the radical change that had taken place in my life. And before I knew it, I had a group of friends sort of in the age range of 20 to 30 to 21 to 35, something like that. And I began to, again, I didn't even have the terminology for this, because if any of you were raised Methodist, you probably understand what I mean. There's various different, let me just say this. When I was 19, I went to be a counselor at the church camp that I had attended every year through my, really starting at grade school all the way through my senior year in high school. And I went at 19 to be a counselor. And I was shocked to discover that every pastor that I talked to, including the director of the camp, the leader of the camp, they were essentially atheists. They didn't really believe in the Bible. They had deconstructed before deconstruction was popular, because they'd gone to seminary and they'd learned a lot of the things that now a lot of us know about, just the problems with the texts themselves. It's very hard to take an intellectually honest look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and draw the conclusion that they are part of some set of books that are the inerrant word of God. There's problems in the texts themselves. And then when you study how it was put together and how we got the Bible, there's just a whole bunch of problems. And so most people, in fact, I had a friend that I went to church camp with, who after high school went to seminary and went through a real crisis of faith because of this. Because as you begin to access this knowledge and you begin to deal with it in any level of intellectual honesty, you're going to have a crisis of faith. And so everybody in the district of the Methodist Church in the Rocky Mountain District that I would run into, with maybe one or two exceptions, had experienced this. And so they were, like I said, essentially atheists, didn't have a lot of faith and trust in the scriptures and whatever the case may be. And that led to a collision at 19. I remember the last day of church camp, the director of the church camp bringing me, scolding me and chastising me for my faith and for sharing that part of my faith with other people. So that left me disillusioned with the Methodist Church. And so I began to attend it was a Disciples of Christ church that was close to my house. And again, Disciples of Christ, this isn't charismatic, but it's also not super fundamentalist, although it was more fundamentalist than the Methodist Church that I grew up in. And so, again, I would have this issue very early on, 18, 19 years old. I would be reading the scriptures, and it's full of miracles. It's full of Jesus' ministry was characterized, if by nothing else, primarily by healing the sick, by driving out demons, by people having encounters. Take, for example, the woman at the well who has an encounter with Christ, who knows things about her, and her life is radically transformed. And she goes back to Samaria and opens up the city through her testimony to be receptive to Jesus going in later. And I would read all this stuff, about all of this incredible, miraculous stuff that's happening in the Bible, and then I wouldn't see it anywhere in the church. And so I started trying different churches and different traditions, and the closest I could find, or the closest that I could come back then, was the Charismatic Church. And I remember the first time I attended a healing crusade. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I think it was divinely ordained, I don't think the evangelist was very authentic. I don't think there was any authentic healing that happened. But there was, other aspects that I wasn't aware of, like speaking in tongues, prophecy, generally what we called the gifts of the Spirit. And I don't want to belabor the point here, but kind of came up into, I just had this determination: if this stuff is true, if the Bible is true, then we should be able, as believers and followers of Christ, we should be able to reproduce what Christ did. We should be able to see healings and miracles. And I was thinking about this last night. Probably the greatest privilege in my life has been able to help people to experience these things, and particularly in the arena of healing and wellness, both physically, psychologically, mentally, and emotionally. I remember the first time I ever witnessed an actual, what I would call, divine healing. My neighbor had sprained her ankle, and it had swelled up pretty good. And so I said, well, let me just pray for it. And so early on, I kind of figured this thing out, that, Jesus, the disciples, they didn't pray for healing. They didn't ask God up in the sky to do a healing, but that there was a gift that was resident within Jesus, and gifts that were resident within some of the believers, and that there would be the Bible speaks in Luke chapter 5 about virtue or power flowing out of Jesus. Whenever Peter healed a lame man, he said, such as I have, give I thee. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. And so I placed my hands on her ankle, and I just began to speak to the ankle and command it to be healed. And I could literally feel under my hands the tissues moving and mending in the ankle, and all the pain left. Shortly, all the swelling went down, and she was able to completely walk. And so we would gather together as a group My oldest sister, Lori, is very gifted, um, intuitively, psychically, very gifted. And she was also leading this group with me. And we would meet, and every night we would get together and we would have these sort of, I wouldn't even really call them prayer meetings, because if I say prayer meeting, it's going to give you the wrong idea. But just this thing where we would just dive into spirit, and we would have incredible experiences, experiences with power, experiences with what we called angels back then. Certainly many, 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 many more experiences of divine healing. But there were even prophetic experiences where knowledge and information would come through one of us that we would have no, what you might call natural way of ascertaining and finding out about it on our own. And so the ministry that I ended up having and the church that I ended up having in Pueblo grew up very organically. In 2000, in the year 2000, yeah, summer of 2000, I had another experience. I had a visionary experience that left me very disillusioned with evangelical Christianity and with charismatic Pentecostal Christianity. I have always been sort of a rebel when it comes to the church system. Never really fit within the church system, but did cultivate a ministry that was helping and benefiting a lot of people, not just, again, with physical healing, but with mental and emotional. So when we started our church, our vision was to be a therapeutic community, or to be a healing community. And it developed and grew up from there, and became effective enough that I was invited to travel both nationally and internationally and do healing crusades and teach people how to operate in what we called then the gifts of the Spirit. So I just had, over the 25 years before I had this experience on August 13th, 2016, just decades and decades of experience with almost every kind of supernatural phenomena that you can imagine. And really what happened to me in 2016, if I step back from it, it probably began in about, I want to say, 2008. So really about 8 years of pursuing mystical Christianity. In 2000, when I had the experience and I got disillusioned with the Christian models, even the charismatic Pentecostal models, I began to study metaphysics. I began to read things like A Course in Miracles. I began to read, Greg Braden at the time was writing books. And again, I would go and spend my time at Barnes & Noble in the sort of the New Age section and just read anything I could get my hands on. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, stuff about shamanism, all kinds of metaphysical stuff. When Eckhart Tolle wrote Eckhart Tolle, I've heard it pronounced both ways, when he wrote the book, The Power of Now. I remember when that came out, and I read The Power of Now, and I connected it with scriptures, and I preached almost for an entire year on the principles in that book, but doing it from scripture. Nobody had any idea that I was reading metaphysical stuff, because if I would have told them, they would have said that I was of the devil. So really, I had decades of experience in the metaphysical community without identifying with the metaphysical community, and was taking metaphysical principles and really a lot of New Age principles and finding them in the scriptures, and then teaching those things to the people that were following. And so what I'm trying to say is, the entire time that I identified as a Christian and that I was in ministry, it was very experiential, and a lot of emphasis was placed on experience and spirituality. And like I said, probably had just about any kind of mystical experience that's out there, had experience with it. So I started reading Christian mystics. the early church fathers. This is back in 2000, along with the metaphysical stuff that I was looking at. And then I became involved with this sort of stream of mystical Christianity. Some of you, if I were to say the names of some of the leaders of that movement, you would know who I'm talking about. Some of you would have no idea. And I don't endorse it today, so I'm just going to skip over that part. But one of the things that I began to do was learn ancient methods of meditation. And by ancient, some would say they went back to Second Temple Judaism and the time of Christ. Intellectually, I became very interested in the mystical aspects of Judaism from the Second Temple. And then other people would say these were mystical practices of meditation that really began about the 13th century. Still, that's going back centuries. So I think it's fair to say I started practicing these much older forms of meditation in order to develop my mystical life, my spiritual life. And as I began to do this, particularly in 2015, I went through a period of time where I would, without setting my alarm, without really even setting any kind of intention, I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I would go into a space in my basement and I would spend time practicing these meditative techniques. And these meditative techniques definitely opened me up to spiritual senses, to what in the metaphysical world is called the clairs: clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, claircognizance. Um, Clairvoyance was really the first one. Clairvoyance is a French word that means clear seeing or clear vision. Clairaudience, clear hearing; clairsentience, clear feeling; claircognizance, clear knowing; cognition, you can kind of see the words there: clairsentience, sensing; claircognition, claircognizance, that has to do with cognition, has to do with knowing. And these are terms that were developed in France in the 19th century, popularized by a journal that was published in France that has kind of become the language that's used among especially psychic mediums to talk about the ability to sense and access information that's not coming in through the five physical senses or in through natural means. And so those things started to open up. I know I've taken a long time to tell my story here, but it's important to where I'm going. And I just want to help you understand from my journey where I'm at today and how I'm pivoting. But I would go into my basement, I would do these meditative techniques, and clairvoyance would open up. I would have literal visions. And I'm not just talking about visions in my head or imaginative visions. And I'm talking about being able to see things out here, and yet they weren't solid. But the more I explored what today I would call my own consciousness, or the realm of consciousness, I would meet beings. And of course, coming from the Christian tradition, Jesus was very often one of the beings that would appear to me in my visions and in my times. And so 2015, I went through about 8 months where I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I would go downstairs and start meditating, and Jesus would show up in a vision and begin to teach me various different principles about the mystical life. And I remember one evening, I didn't wake up at 3 in the morning, but I'm having this dream. And as I'm having this dream, I'm walking down this mountain with Jesus beside me. And in between us is a line. Now, also in 2008, I went and got trained in neurolinguistic programming. I was doing my graduate work in psychology and counseling. And one of the things in NLP that they talk about is timelines. And there's this whole thing of timeline therapy. And so I was familiar with this idea of timelines in a way that a lot of people wouldn't be, that hadn't had that training. And we're walking down this timeline and we're going back in time. And I'm really struggling with this idea of the things that Jesus is telling me about time. And as I begin to wake up, I'm waking up, but I'm still in the visionary experience. I'm still in the dream. So my eyes are open, but I'm still in the dream. And Jesus looks at me and says, unless you let go of your concept of time and space, you'll never be able to taste of the powers of the age to come. And then he vanished. That was back in 2015. More or less since that time, I didn't see a visionary image of Jesus anymore. So people might say, well, Aaron, you were making that up in your mind, making it up in your head. And I understand the argument. And I have no interest in trying to convince people that what I experienced was real. It was real to me. Some people, I suppose, would even say it was a form of psychosis, and they're entitled to their opinion. But what I can tell you is after that dream, I would try to force the experiences that I was having before. In other words, I would go downstairs, I would go into my meditation room, and I would expect to see Jesus again. I would expect to have those experiences. Nothing. I was able, even sometimes when I'd be ministering or I'd be in meetings, I could manufacture in my imagination, because I do know the difference. I could manufacture a picture of Jesus in my mind. And the way I looked at it back then was that kind of created a doorway. It was sort of like a way of dialing up the phone number, if you will. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but I'm just trying to give you an illustration. I know that I'm making the picture, an image in my head, and then oftentimes the energies would come through. And I wasn't able to do this. I wasn't even able to make the picture. It was as though when Jesus spoke those words to me in that experience and said, unless you let go of your understanding, your concepts of time and space, you'll never partake of the power of the age to come. It's almost as though what I gleaned from that, what I gathered from that, was that Orthodox Christianity, and Christianity as we know it, has been built on a approach that says what matters is the history. What matters is that Jesus was a historical person, that he lived 2,000 years ago, that he walked the shores of Galilee, that he literally and historically died on a cross, that he literally and historically rose from the dead, that there were 12 apostles or disciples that followed Jesus, that heard the teachings of Jesus, and then they were later preserved for us in the Gospels, and they have come down to us. And through very natural means of reading and rationalizing and going through a discursive process, in other words, a line upon line, very much the same way we would learn anything, the way we would learn science or astronomy or history, by feeding, definitely history, right? By feeding on this information, putting this information in our minds, and then we would know who we are and we would know how we were supposed to live. There's nothing mystical about it at all. And so what I began to understand was that the entire religious structure is rooted in concepts that are based on time and space. In this case, based on history. And so making sure that we get our faith right in regards to history. And so we relate with, when people say, in the grace movement, we used to say, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. And when people would say that, they're really referring to a location. In other words, God manifested in the flesh, that's location, that's space. Jesus walking the earth 2,000 years ago, that's time. And everything grows out of that. And what was necessary for me was to understand that that's beginning in the wrong place. And so that's why at that point it was completely disorienting to me. And I had to learn how to operate in a different space. And so just a year removed from that time period, just about right around, that would have been in the spring of 2015. So then the summer of 2016, I have this experience, and I'm still doing meditative experiences. I'm still exploring consciousness. The problem is that Jesus is no longer a part of it. And I'm experiencing these other entities. And so these entities started communicating with me. And on August 13, 2016, it was these other entities, these other beings that exposed for me the futility of religious pursuit, at least for me. I know that sounds to people who are really rooted in dispensationalism, which is a theological, it's where we get all the rapture, end time kind of stuff. That's called dispensationalism. That's going to sound like, seducing spirits, doctrines of demons, angels, the devil manifest, disguising himself as an angel of light. And don't think that I didn't think about those things or have to work through those things back then. So my issue was not that. That's why I just struggle with materialism. I can just never be a materialist or an atheist. I just can't. The rabid skepticism, the dogma around there is no God is kind of interesting to me. It's kind of funny to me because it's, in my mind, different side of the same coin. The emotional energy behind it. We want people to conform to this. Anybody that talks about stuff like I'm talking about right now is psychotic or crazy or deluded or not very smart, whatever the case may be. They don't realize they're operating in the same energy and the same spirit. And it gets us to the same place. Religion prevents us from entering the realm of spirit where there is no time and space. And scientific materialism does the same thing. They're both naturalistic in their approaches. Religion is naturalistic in that its focus is on some kind of historical revelation that has come down to us. In Judaism, it comes down through Moses. In Islam, obviously, it comes down through the Prophet Muhammad. And in Christianity, it comes down through the historical person of Jesus. It's natural in that sense. It's if Jesus lived and you lived 2,000 years ago and you were lucky enough, you could, as it's written in 1 John, you could see, you could touch, you could handle the word of life. It's in time and space. Spirit is completely outside of time and space. Consciousness is completely outside of time and space. And so there's an interesting verse of scripture. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, Luke 11:52 in the King James, it says, "Woe unto you lawyers, he's talking to the Pharisees here, Jesus is. He says, "Woe unto you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered." I like the NIV version of this better. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Woe to you, experts of the law. Woe to you, experts of the law. So the law had to do with natural things. It had to do with your behaviors. It had to do with how you showed up and how you expressed yourself, whether or not you kept the Sabbath, whether or not you kept the dietary laws, whether or not you kept the purity laws, whether or not you went to the temple, whether or not you celebrated the feasts, right? And then if you didn't, you were sinning, and then you were under condemnation and all of this stuff. And Jesus says, woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. Interesting, because experts, you would assume, have knowledge. And if they're teaching based on their expertise, are they not disseminating knowledge? And yet Jesus says something very interesting here. He says, woe unto you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. It's such a powerful truth about religion. If someone is connected and having spiritual experiences and fully spiritually awake, they don't need a religious institution. They don't need the church because they have their own personal relationship, right? But in the same way, there are a lot of other things out there, whether it's scientific materialism in some respects, and I know this is going to upset some people, but I would say in some respects, what passes for non-dualism or non-duality, everything is just the self. Well, that would not allow then for other entities and beings to interact with you, would it? Paul says in another place in the Bible, he says they have a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. So these are all natural based. They're not spirit based. That's my point. I was transitioning more and more into a spirit based reality back in that time. All right. I hope this is making some sense to you guys. So that's the problem with religion. It prevents people from moving into those spiritual spaces. That's the problem with our Western culture dominated by materialism. It prevents people from being able to move into those spaces because they don't realize, they don't know that they have these clairs, that they have these other senses whereby they can sense, that where they can feel into, see into, hear into a different realm and a different arena that is not bound by the laws of time and space. Now, I had been operating up until that time at a certain level of success with healing ministry and answers to prayer and all of that kind of stuff. And so my problem was never, I don't believe in that stuff, or I'm not experiencing that stuff. I didn't have the same issues that a lot of people had, where it's like, well, I prayed and nothing happened. Or I've never had anything out of the ordinary that I've experienced. That was not me at all. My problem was that I thought that we had cornered the market, which is really kind of funny, because what helped me tap into that spiritual realm back then was all the metaphysical stuff that I was reading, all the stuff that wasn't religious, right? And yet I thought somehow we had the right religion. And so these types of experiences were only valid if they came through the church, or if they were only valid if they were done in the name of Jesus. The only valid spiritual guidance was guidance that could come from the Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, whatever the case may be. So as I began to do these meditative practices still, I began to encounter other beings. And so in 2017, I made the decision, I'm going to go out and explore other traditions. I worked with shamans. I worked with people who came out of Eastern philosophies. One of my first mentors in this was a very, very spiritual woman from Korea, who did, the very first time I met with her, she did past life regression therapy on me. And I'm like, I don't even believe in past lives, but yet I couldn't deny the benefit that I gained from that single session with her. In fact, I worked with her at a metaphysical fair for like 20, 30 minutes. And even people around me had said that my countenance had changed. There was a definite shift that had happened from this sort of 20, 30 minutes of past life regression therapy. So what is this? And then the most powerful encounter that I'd ever had happened during a working directly with a shaman in Sedona, Arizona. And in that experience, there were entities that didn't look like Jesus, and they didn't look like angels. They didn't look like anything that I would expect. And the encounter, I was no stranger to power encounters, and that encounter was so much more powerful than anything I'd experienced previously that I really didn't know what to do with it. Never really have talked about it except to people that were really, really close to me. But suffice it to say that through this process, I developed relationships with what some might call spirit guides. Now, before all my materialist friends or everyone in the audience just, freaks out over that, pick up Carl Jung's book called The Red Book. The Red Book is sort of Carl Jung's personal journey and personal experiences in exploring his own consciousness. And he met a guide in his own consciousness that he called, or that called itself, Philemon, and encountered all kinds of strange phenomena. People who have out-of-body experiences, people who astral project, go out into the astral realm and encounter all kinds of entities and things of this nature. Why we should think, if the Hermetic axiom is true, as above, so below, when we look at the so below, there are so many different manifestations of physical life just in the microbe kingdom, right? Many different types of fungus, many different types of bacteria, all living entities, very, very different. And they're very different than plants. And how many different plants are there? And plants are very different than insects. And how many different kinds of insects are there? And insects are very different than fish. And how many different kinds of fish are there? And fish are very different than animals. And animals are different than birds. And that's all just in this physical plane. It's incomprehensible how many different types and manifestations of life is out there. And yet Christians will say we believe in a creator who created this vast diversity, and yet expect people to conform to exactly what they think that they should be in a uniform way, which all religions do. So if, as I said, the Hermetic axiom is true, as above, so below, why shouldn't we expect that when we begin to navigate the realms of consciousness, when we begin to navigate the realms of the spirit, that we are going to encounter beings and entities that can be equally as diverse, maybe even more diverse, and people who've had real experience doing this, not people that just get on and make videos grinding their, sharpening their axe because they have an issue with religion, or people who limit themselves to their experiences, though their experience is law and rule for everybody else. So therefore, there can't be other entities that aren't aspects of the self, that aren't that don't have a independent existence. I was watching a video from someone who trains in internal family systems. Internal family systems, it was just this last week. In internal family systems, it's a therapeutic model where you look at various different ego states as parts or aspects of the self, so that you have internal family members, but they're all perceived as part of the individual, individable individual. It's all just you. It's just you relating to you through various different parts and ego states. And the more that this gentleman got into internal family systems, the more he began to discover that there were also transpersonal parts. There were beings that were other than the self. So I'm going to trust someone who understands psychology and understands the nature of the mind. And IFS is probably as big a therapeutic model in the secular world today as there is. And yet here's a guy who was a materialist who understands the various different aspects of the self. I see some of this stuff on Facebook where people are like, well, no, that's just an aspect of you. You wouldn't even know. Like, I'm going to trust somebody that's worked with thousands of people and studied the concepts and really devoted energy with openness and no axe to grind, no agenda, who then comes along and says, as we were exploring these dimensions of the self, we met, or have encountered over and over again, entities and beings that were not part of the self, but were separate from the self, but were still interacting with the person. So you might be out there and you may have experienced, some kind of communication with a loved one that moved on. You might have experienced something where you encountered a being that was an angel or even a demon or something altogether. And this was these entities that I was encountering, they would be something altogether. There was no religious box that I could fit them in. I had no previous, like no landing strip for what this was in my brain because I had no previous experience for it. So at one point, about 2 years ago, let me back up. I feel like I'm all over the place. So my point is, I thought as Christians, we had cornered the market on this. And what I discovered was, no, there's this vast world. There's this vast array of spirit. And we weren't the only ones that could heal. We weren't the only ones that had visions. We weren't the only ones that had wisdom. We weren't the only ones that had light. We weren't the only ones that had something to offer. All these other paths offer something to us. I think probably the best path that I found for spiritual technology could be labeled as the shamanic path. But again, language is difficult because you say shaman or shamanic and people automatically associate that with indigenous groups, and rightfully so. But when I'm talking about the technology, not the culture. So it's not cultural appropriation. It's saying that ancient shaman had a spiritual technology that we have lost. And that by learning this spiritual technology, we can open up then to our own spirit being, to our own divinity, and to the spiritual world that is out there. And we can be taught how to do that. My heart breaks for people that they'll say that are confused. My heart breaks for people that say that really have spiritual hunger and really have a hunger for spiritual experience and spiritual connection. These types of teachings resonate with them, but they don't have their own personal experience with these things. And then they can walk away feeling like they're less than. Same thing in the church. If I were to sit around and talk about all the miracles I saw and all the prayers that got answered, somebody who's never had a goosebump in church that wasn't emotional, that's had no connection or sense with what they might identify as the presence of God, they're going to the potential, there's a lot of potential there for them to think there's something wrong with me. And my heart breaks because while I was innately wired this way, just like a musician, some people, just have natural musical talent. Some people have natural physical abilities. All of us have a propensity to different things. I was born with an awareness of these abilities, with them bleeding through in my life without me doing anything. But I also had to develop them, and I had to learn how to develop them. And I have a history of being able to teach people how to develop them. But I walked away from all of that for a lot of reasons. About 2 years ago, I just shut everything off. And partly because it became so confusing, because there are so many voices out there. There's so many different paths. There's so many different teachings, and people don't agree with each other, and it becomes almost tribal, if you will. And so it just becomes easier to say, screw it. I know this physical world is what's here. I know this is all there is. And I don't know, is non-dualism right? Are the pagans right? Are the New Agers right? Is the law of one right? Is the um, what's that stuff? New Thought group, are they right? Is the shamanic tradition right? You see what I'm saying? And especially so, if you don't have any personal experience and you don't commit to a thing, one path, and explore it and try it out. And I'm not just talking about trying it out on Wednesday and giving up on it on Sunday, but work with it for a period of time. You don't have time to let the fruit of that and the evidence of that develop for you in your life. And so it's just like, my God, I'm just, you get in this deconstruction crowd, everybody kind of disagrees with each other. The only thing we agree on is the church sucks. And so that's, where this group kind of gathers around. And the vast majority end up in materialism, which in my view does us no good spiritually. And so I shut all this down and I just said, you know what, I'm just going to counsel. Sometimes my clairs, my psychic abilities come through in counseling in a way that's really beneficial and helpful to people, but I'm not going to do anything publicly. I'm not going to do anything in a group really with this. And I'm just going to raise my kids and live my life. And then last August, day after my birthday, I end up in the hospital with basically acute end-stage heart failure, an insane level of atrial fibrillation, and blood clots. It's in really, really bad shape, really close to death. I can't remember if I've shared this part publicly or not, but I wasn't able to sleep that night last year. I was tossing and turning, waking up, not breathing, having all kinds of issues and problems. And in the morning, after the sun had come up, I decided I'm going to try and go back to sleep. I'm so tired. And I rolled over and I started to fall asleep. And these beings that I'm telling you about that I encountered in Sedona show up in my mind. And they tell me, Aaron, if you go back to sleep, you will be lost and they will never find you. And I thought, that's a crazy thought. That doesn't make any sense. I'm right here. I'm in bed. How could I be lost? Of course they're going to find me. They're going to find me in bed, just like they would if I laid here awake. So I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. And I get almost to sleep. And again, these beings, these entities appear to me and say, Aaron, if you go back to sleep, you will be lost and they will never find you. That happened 3 times. Finally, I get up, get out of bed, walk across the floor. My heart rate's up to 150. My oxygen levels plummeted. And I'm on my way to the emergency room. I find out that my heart's operating at less than 20% capacity. And the next stage then was cardiac arrest. So I genuinely believe if I'd gone back to sleep, my family would have lost me in this life. And so they warned me. They intervened. I wasn't seeking it, wasn't asking for it. It just happened. And that whole process, I'm fine now, I'm healthy now, but that whole process forced me to reevaluate everything and to get back in alignment, frankly, if I can be honest, with my purpose, which is to reveal spiritual knowledge, to hand people the key to knowledge so that they can enter into it for themselves. And that isn't religion, like what I did in the past, nor is it materialistically rooted philosophies, out of which comes atheism. And it certainly isn't by just keeping my mouth shut, not sharing with anybody, and living my life. So that heart failure was one of the greatest gifts that I could have been given, because it woke me up to the value and the importance of my mission here, my purpose here, which is to, again, give the key that will open this up. So I'm pivoting away from all this talk about deconstruction. My heart has incredibly softened towards the church, towards people in the church. I find it completely disinteresting to talk about how negative it is. Are there negative aspects to it? Sure. Are people still going through deconstruction, and do they need to help sorting that out? Sure. But to what end? To what end? If someone's leaving religion, shouldn't they be leaving religion so that they can get the key to knowledge, so that they can enter into their own divinity and this incredible realm that we call spirit? Or do we keep that door locked and just switch philosophies? So that's the difference. And I've spent way too much time on the negative deconstruction aspects of things. And I want to devote the rest of my life to further exploring these realms of consciousness, further exploring spirituality, and taking what I've learned over a lifetime of experience with this and not keeping it to myself, but creating content that will allow people to enter in. So I'm going to ask for your support in that. I will be, my goal for today. So let me just back up. If you've been following me, you notice that I've been putting a lot more posts up on Facebook under with a lot of different ideas and content in it, written posts. And I was able to create that content because I had taken a week not to just go on vacation or rest and relax, but I had taken a week up in the mountains to focus on what's the next season look like for me, what is the next direction for me, for my family, etc. And having that time really allowed me to hone in on the things that I'm really good at and the things that I really have to offer. And when I'm away from that, working my 9-to-5 job, and all of this other stuff, I am not able to give myself as fully to it as I would like to. So I'm going to be asking for donors, monthly donors, who can help support the work and support me and support what I'm doing, so that I can create more YouTube content and I can create more social media content and really just give myself wholly and fully over to that stuff. So if you're interested in that, follow me, subscribe to my channel, and I'll be sharing with you in the next week ways that you can partner with us to be able to do some of those things. Many of you have already partnered with us. Many of you have been supporting us financially, and I deeply appreciate that. And really, it's just enough to maintain the operations of what we have locally. Not enough for me to be able to really devote my time to doing stuff out here like this. So I'm going to be seeking and soliciting more of that. I probably at some point will put courses out for purchase. I did a workshop last month on a donation basis. I plan on doing one next month. I'll be getting that information out on a donation basis, talking about just basic principles of healing, talking about the essentials of spirituality, stuff like that. A lot of that's going to go behind a paywall because that's the best way that I'm able to devote myself to getting this information out. And also, I am available for coaching sessions still. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me. I'm working on a website. Just got a lot of stuff going on. Don't have the money right now to hire anybody to help me. So it's going a little bit slower than I want it to. But I wanted to come on here and just encourage you that that spirit is real, that you are spiritual, that every single person that's watching this, that's hearing this, has the capacity for spiritual growth and has the capacity for spiritual experience. Every single person has the capacity to go through that door to knowledge, if you will. They just need the key. So thank you for watching this. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your support. And I hope this was helpful for you. Please let me know in the comments what you think of this kind of content. Let me know. Don't be afraid to let me know how I can improve, because without that kind of feedback, I don't know I'm not going to be able to be at my best. So please leave comments that can help me improve on the content, what I'm doing. And in the meantime, God bless you. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time you're watching this. If you're watching by replay, I really appreciate it. If you're supporting us financially, I really deeply appreciate it.